Oklahoma.
Ask unanimous consent that my 10 minutes might be extended by about 10 more minutes.
Without objection.
Let me start off, Mr. President, before the leader leaves the floor, and I was hoping to do this before the chaplain of the Senate, Barry Black, left. I had a horrible loss 8 days ago, losing a son. And it was so touching to me, and I want to thank Barry Black, who included a good bit of some things about my son and about me in his opening prayer. And also the comments that were made, the very general comments were very helpful, were made by the majority leader. So I want to, through the chair, thank Harry Reid very much for the comments he made. Mr. President, we have something coming up that we're going to be talking about this week, and I'm a little disturbed because I don't know exactly when it's going to be coming up. I don't know how many objections there are going to be. I just know that there are some people who would want to use this since it is a must-pass bill. This is the National Defense Authorization Act. We passed it every year for, I think, 51 years. We've never failed to pass it. This is not going to be the first year that we fail to pass it. But I'm hoping that our members will recognize how significant this is. First of all, I want to say, as the ranking member on the Senate Armed Services Committee, that I want to thank my colleague, the chairman of the committee, Chairman Levin, for his leadership and his cooperation that we enjoyed during the committee markup of this bill. We got it through the committee in a pretty fast order. People realized there's some things that had to be taken up on the floor, very controversial, 3 very controversial issues. Fine, this is where it should be taken up. It will be taken up. There will be amendments that I will strongly oppose and some that I will support. But I've always considered the National Defense Authorization Act to be the most important piece of legislation Congress considers each year. Now, this bill contains crucial authorizations that support our men and women in harm's way in Afghanistan and around the world. It supports training of our service members, maintenance and modernization for their equipment to ensure they're prepared to overwhelm any adversary and return home safely to their loved ones. But, and this is the big but it does so only as the reduced defense spending will allow. It authorizes research and development efforts that will ensure we maintain technological superiority over our enemies and we can successfully defeat the threats of tomorrow. But again, it does so only, this is different, this has never happened before, when we are facing a reduction in our military spending that is so unacceptably low that it has caused our leaders in all 4 services, which I will read in just a moment, to talk about how this is life-threatening. But most importantly, one thing that we will continue to do is provide for the pay and the benefits of the brave men and women who are in harm's way. That's to defend this nation. In an era increasingly defined by partisan gridlock, the NDAA, that's the National Defense Authorization Act, is one of the rare occasions when members of both parties can come together out of a shared commitment to our military and men and women. This enduring commitment was exemplified again this year by the overwhelming bipartisan majority that supported the passage of the NDAA from committee in June. I look forward to continue this tradition and this cooperation until we get this thing passed. Now, consideration of this year's NDAA comes at a pivotal moment for our national security. The global security environment we face is more volatile and dangerous than any other time in my memory, or I suggest in the history of this country. Yet our ability to protect the country against these growing threats is at serious risk. After losing $487 billion that just came out of the defense budget through the first 5 years of this administration, we now are looking at sequestration. Sequestration is an outcome thought to be so egregious and irresponsible that it would never be allowed to happen. None of us believed it would happen, that we'd be facing, after already losing $487 billion from our defense system, to have to be facing sequestration. And I never can say sequestration without reminding people. Why is it that our budget, that only 18% of our budget goes to defending America, and yet they have been forced to endure 50% of the cuts? It's wrong, but nonetheless, that's what's been happening over the last, now we're looking at, it's been in effect for 8 months. It's drastic. Across the board cuts are exacerbating the effects of an already declining national security budget. Now, as a result, the military is experiencing a dramatic decline in readiness and capabilities. Let's put that chart up, if you would, John. General Odierno, the Chief of Staff of the Army, recently said that his forces are at a, and I'm quoting now, quote, lowest readiness levels I've seen within our Army since I have been serving for the last 37 years, and that only 2 brigades are ready for combat. Only 2 brigades. This is General Odierno. The reason I wanted this chart put up, because it tells us where we are today. The orange, which is the huge cuts that come with sequestration, far greater than the rest of them. That's readiness. That's what we're talking about. Now, we do hear a lot about the cost of personnel and all of that, but that is in the lower blue. So you're not talking about, if you're able to do away with those, actually coming up with any major reductions. The yellow is force structure. Now, we're talking about, as Odierno said, down to only 2 brigades that are ready for combat. That's because of what's already been happening in the last 8 months in the force structure. The modernization is the green. Modernization is always the first thing to be cut when force cuts come in, because they figure that's something that you just don't feel the pain of today. But there it is, the orange. I want you to concentrate on that, because that's where it really would hurt. So we had General Odierno saying his forces were the lowest readiness levels he's seen in his 37 years in the United States Army. I was in the Army many, many years ago, and I can remember back then when it always had priority over everything. Defending America seemed to be the thing. Admiral Greenert, Chief of Naval Operations, he said, and I'm quoting him, he says, because of fiscal limitations and the situation we are in, we don't have another strike group trained and ready to respond on short notice in case of a contingency. We're tapped out. That's our Navy. Our top military leaders now warn that of being unable to protect American interests around the world. Admiral Winfield, he's the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the next to the highest military. He said earlier this year, and I'm quoting him, he said, there could be, for the first time in my career, instances where we may be asked to respond to a crisis and we will have to say we cannot. General Dempsey, the #1 military chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he's warned that continued national security cuts, and I'm quoting, he said, will, quote, severely limit our ability to implement our defense strategy. It will put our nation at a greater risk of coercion, and it will break faith with the men and women in uniform. And that's why I'm so troubled that this disastrous path that we're on, in the face of mounting threats to America, prolonged budgetary uncertainties, and the mindless sequestration cuts are crippling the people who are vital to our security, our men and women in the military. And to be clear, our military was facing readiness shortfalls even before sequestration took effect. Sequestration has only been in effect for 8 months. We never dreamed it would, after all the cuts that we've gotten out of it from, quite frankly, this administration. So the equipment, the problems that we have, rather than rebuild the ability of our military to defend the country, we're digging ourselves deeper in a hole. The longer we allow military readiness and capabilities to decline, the more money and time it will take to rebuild. We're falling victim to the misguided belief that as the wars of today wind down, we can afford to gut investments in our nation's defense. This is an irresponsible and dangerous course. You know, I remember back during the middle of the 90s, they talked about a peace dividend at that time. And I can remember they're saying, well, the Cold War is over, we no longer need that strong of a military. Now, in this day and age, it is so much more serious than it has been in the past. Our top military leaders agree in testimony before the Armed Services Committee last week. General Amos, he's the Commandant of the Marine Corps, he testified that if he is tasked to respond to a contingency in the current budget environment, and I'm quoting, "We will have fewer forces arriving less trained, arriving later to the fight. This would delay the buildup of combat power, allow the enemy more time to build its defenses, and would likely prolong combat operations altogether. This is a formula for more American casualties." That's the Commandant of the Marine Corps. Now, such an outcome would be immoral and a dereliction of duty. If we expect the men and women of our military to go into harm's way to protect America, we have an obligation to provide them with the training, technology, and capabilities required to decisively overwhelm any adversary at any time and return safely home to their loved ones. Under this sequestration, we can't do it. This is what we're talking about right here when I say we are talking about the obligation to provide the training, technology, and capabilities. That's all that orange. That means that's what we're not going to do. This is why ending sequestration and protecting the readiness of our military men and women remains my top priority. However, something must be done now to mitigate the devastating impacts to readiness until we can find a long-term solution. This is why now, again, I'm just talking a little bit about the significance of having our Defense Authorization Bill come to the floor, get it started, start working on amendments. This is what is important. But in order to address the shortfalls that we have, I have an amendment that would phase sequester in a way that would allow our senior military leaders to enact reforms without disproportionately degrading our ability to train and prepare our military men and women to protect this country. Now, let me say quickly, one of my closest friends in this chamber is one of the senators from Alabama, Jeff Sessions. Jeff Sessions, as we speak, is on a plane on his way back from California. So he can't be here. Jeff Sessions has come up with an amendment, and he's on the Budget Committee. He's a real budget hawk, and he still is willing to increase the military by 1% with a proposed amendment that he might have. When Jeff Sessions gets back, I'm going to talk to him about going together on his amendment so that we can maybe merge the two amendments together. My amendment seeks to leverage what General Odierno refers to as ramping, a rephasing of the sequestration cuts that reduce the impact of fiscal year 2014 and 2050 to a more manageable level and shifts the remainder of the required cuts in the remaining years. So we're talking about you wouldn't feel it as much in these first 2 years, and yet we would make up for it, and that's why it is budget neutral. The Congressional Budget Office told me that this amendment will not score, and that's very important to a lot of people. Let me be real clear. I remain committed to ending sequestration of our military men and women. My amendment does not fix sequestration, nor will it impede my continued push for fixing sequestration. We're going to continue to do that. It's immoral that we're not doing it. However, the damage being done to our military is so egregious and reckless under the current sequester mechanism that I have no choice but to take this step to avoid an even greater readiness catastrophe that would seriously damage our national security. I talked just a few minutes ago to General Odierno. He's the commander, he's the top person in the United States Army. I've made a couple of notes here. I want to make sure I don't misquote him because he said, if we can do what we're trying to do with this amendment, in other words, backload some of this stuff, and it would actually save money 3 or 4 years from now. Because if you start cutting right now across the board, as would be mandated by sequestering, then you're going to be cutting in areas where it's going to cost you more to come back and do that. So I think you'll find most of the military is very very anxious to do that. Again, I'm not going to introduce this until we have a chance to talk to Senator Sessions and hopefully come up with something that will be sellable to this body. In addition to my concerns about sequestration, this bill contains several provisions that I find deeply problematic. In particular, I strongly oppose the sections that would loosen restrictions on the transfer of detainees from Guantanamo Bay to the United States or to countries like Yemen that remain vulnerable to al-Qaeda and its terrorist affiliates. I've got to ad-lib here a little bit because I can't remember how many years I've been trying to save one of the greatest assets this country has, and that's Guantanamo Bay. I say to my good friend in the chair that this is one of the few good deals that we have, because we've had Guantanamo Bay since 1904, and it has cost us, I think, the total $4,000 a year, and Castro forgets to collect about every other year. So it's one of the few good deals that we have out there. It's one of the only place you can put these combatants where they are in a position where they can be interrogated and we can save American lives. And I don't know why this President Obama, has this obsession to turn these people out of Guantanamo Bay back in the United States. He first did this his first year, 4 years ago. He had a plan. He had located, I think it was 17 places in America where he could send these terrorists back in. One of them happened to be in my state of Oklahoma at Fort Sill. I always remember that. I went down to Fort Sill. I say to the chair that because I found out that we have a small prison down there, and the major, a female who runs that prison, said to me, she said, "I can't understand what's wrong with you people in Washington, why you have that perfectly good facility down there that will save American lives, and people are treated better than they've ever been treated before. One of the major problems we have down there is obesity because they're eating so much. So it's not a matter of not being treated fairly." Well, for some reason, this president has had and one of the problems with turning these people back into America, into our system, is that a terrorist is not a criminal. A terrorist teaches they're in the business of teaching other people to be terrorists. You put them in our prison system, and they're going to be working on the people that are there. And that's why I had such strong feelings about the closing of Guantanamo, or the president's been trying to do that. We've stopped him from doing that for 4.5 years now. We will continue. However, they're trying to make it easier for them to take people out of Guantanamo Bay and send them to my state of Oklahoma and throughout America, and hopefully we can defeat that part of this bill. And while I'm pleased that the bill fully funds the budget request for missile defense and includes provision that would establish a radar site in the East Coast, I remain concerned that we are vulnerable to a growing ballistic missile threat from the Middle East. And let me comment here. I was upset. The first budget that President Obama had, I knew, and again, when you say liberal and conservative, that's not name calling. Liberal simply means you want government to have more involvement in our lives, and he is a liberal person, and most liberals don't think we need a military to start with. And I always remember his first budget. I went over, Mr. President, I went over to Afghanistan so I could be there when he announced his budget. So knowing if I was doing it from there with the tanks going back and forth, I'd get some attention on it. And sure enough, it worked. So in that first budget, the president in his budget did away with our only 5th generation fighter, the F-22, did away with our lift capacity, the C-17 did away with our future combat system, which had been the first advance of ground capability in probably 50 years. But I think the worst of everything, he did away with the site that we're building in Poland and the Czech Republic to be a ground-based interceptor that would take care of something coming from that direction into the United States. You see, Mr. President, we have 33 ground-based interceptors. They're all located on the West Coast. Now our intelligence has told us since 2007 that Iran is going to have the capability of a weapon and a delivery system. By weapon, I'm talking about a nuclear weapon and a delivery system by 2015. We're talking about less than a year and a half from now. And he's going to have that capability. So we were building that for the purpose of being able to catch something coming from that direction. Well, then he took that out and he stopped that. There's other problems with that too, because I remember when we were trying to sell Poland and the Czech Republic on the idea. They said, are you sure now, if we agree and we make Russia angry at us by agreeing to have a ground-based interceptor in Poland and the radar in the Czech Republic, are you sure that some president isn't going to come along and pull the rug out from under us? And I said, I'm absolutely positive, and that's exactly what happened. Well, anyway, I only mentioned that because the radar site on the East Coast certainly would not be effective by the time that they're going to have that capability. But nonetheless, we are addressing it. And I'm pleased that under the Chairman Levin's leadership, the committee was able to reach a compromise during the markup to address the scourge of sexual assault in the military. The Senate bill includes 16 provisions that are specifically targeted to improving the tools the department, the services, the commanders have at their disposal for fighting sexual assaults. Includes an additional 12 provisions to make important improvements to the military justice system in the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And this is a comprehensive, targeted legislative initiative that would address that. So that's going to be controversial. I understand that. I think a lot of us who have served in the military, it happens that I was in the military court many years ago, before most of you guys were born. And at that time, the one thing I learned, and this was way back then, that the commander's influence in discipline is necessary. And we're all going to keep that in mind as we look at some of these amendments. So I look forward to bringing this to the floor as soon as we can, and getting these controversial things out of the way. I'm hoping that I'll get favorable consideration of my amendment that's going to make it much less devastating to the military. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.